If you've scrolled through social media or the news over the last few weeks, you've probably seen some terrifying headlines about the new Ebola outbreak in Central Africa. Some of these posts are making it seem like a zombie plague is about to fly through your window and infect you while you're sleeping. First of all, the virus is not flying through your window, I promise. But today we're going to look at the scientific facts and talk about this new Ebola strain. We're going to debunk the fake news with real peer reviewed data. Let's unpack what's really happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda without media scare tactics. Let's first define some terms so I'm not speaking gibberish. The science world recently updated its dictionary. What we used to call Ebola virus is now technically classified under the genus Ortho Ebola virus. It sounds like some kind of dinosaur species, but it's just the official family name for these microscopic organisms. On May 17th, 2026, the World Health Organization declared this outbreak as PHEIC. This stands for Public Health Emergency of International Concern. Now, when the media hears FEIC, they immediately report it as, oh my god, pandemic incoming. But in reality, a FEIC is just a global medical bat signal. It's an official alert that tells doctors, researchers, and funding agencies worldwide to coordinate their resources and help to stop a localized outbreak before it spreads. So it's about cooperation, not an announcement of global doom. Before we meet our culprit, we have to ask where this virus came from in the first place. Where are these viruses hiding when they don't cause outbreaks, and how do they crash our human party? This brings us to a concept called zoonotic spillover. Zoonotic is just a fancy biology word meaning an illness that originates in wild animals, and a spillover event is exactly that, a highly unlucky moment that a pathogen manages to jump across the species barrier from an animal host to a human. For orthoebolavirus, scientists point their fingers at fruit bats. These bats are natural reservoirs, meaning they can carry the virus without ever getting sick. But if a bat bites into a sweet mango, drools on it, and then drops it, a forest animal like a wild antelope might eat that fruit and catch the virus. When a human handles, hunts, or processes infected forest wildlife, then the virus gets its golden ticket into the human population. So, while the initial animal spillover host for the 2026 outbreak is still being investigated by ecologists, bats and forest wildlife are the main target of surveillance. So, how does the ortho Ebola virus actually make you sick? Let's zoom in on the cellular level because the way this virus invades your body is basically a microscopic heist movie. It starts by targeting your immune system's frontline defenders. So, this is macrophages and dendritic cells. The virus approaches your cell and essentially tricks the defender cells into swallowing it whole through a process called macropinocytosis. Think of it like the cell vacuuming up its surrounding fluids and accidentally sucking in the virus within a tiny cellular bubble called an endosome. Once inside the endosomal bubble, the virus is still trapped in the protective, thick sugar coating called the glycan cap. But here's the twist. Your cell tries to digest the intruder using enzymes called cathepsins. Instead of destroying the virus, the cathepsins act like molecular scissors that trim away the glycan cap, exposing the virus's crowbar. This viral crowbar fits perfectly into a highly specific lock on the inside of the bubble wall, a cholesterol transporter protein called MPC1. Once bound to the MPC1, the virus fuses its membrane with the endosome, unlocks its door, and dumps its genetic blueprint straight into your cell's cytoplasm to turn it into a virus cloning factory. Once the virus replicates, it forces those infected immune cells to scream a massive chemical panic alarm. This is called a cytokine storm. This chemical overload acts like a wrecking ball on your endothelial cells, which are the smooth cells that make up your blood vessel walls. Your vessels start to get micro cracks and become leaky, causing fluids to escape into the surrounding tissues. This is what leads to severe blood pressure drops and swelling, which is actually what causes hypovolemic shock. At the same time, the virus attacks the liver, stopping it from producing critical proteins that help your blood clot. Your body's wound healing cells go into a state of panic, trying to patch up all of the vascular leaks at once, which consumes them entirely. So, this double whammy of leaky vessels and exhausted clotting factors is what causes the infamous wet symptoms and bleeding, which I'll explain further soon. So, who is the actual pathogen causing trouble in 2026? It's called the BDBV strain, or BVD strain. Most of the historically famous Ebola outbreaks, like the massive one in West Africa back in 2014, were caused by its sibling, the Zaire strain. The Zaire strain is incredibly lethal, with a historical death rate of up to 90% if untreated, which is why we spent millions of dollars developing vaccines and treatments specifically for it. But those Zaire tools don't work against this new strain because they have a different surface protein. Our current vaccines basically work by binding to the surface protein of the virus, but they can't attach to BDBV's unique protein shape. This is the exact reason that the World Health Organization declared an emergency. Not because it's more dangerous, but because we're fighting it without our usual medical shield. However, there is a major silver lining. This new BDBV strain is much slower and less lethal than the Zaire strain. Its historical case fatality rate ranges from 25% to 50%. In fact, we've already documented confirmed recoveries during this outbreak. So the virus is highly dangerous, yes, but it's not an unstoppable death sentence. Now, to address the single biggest piece of fake news circulating online, the claim that Ebola is airborne. Now, I know we're all traumatized from COVID, but I can assure you that Ebola is not airborne. It does not at all spread like COVID, the flu, or measles. You cannot catch it by just breathing the same air as an infected person or passing them in a grocery store. I know we're all familiar with how respiratory viruses spread due to COVID, but the spread of Ebola is more like borrowing someone's toothbrush. It requires direct contact with the infected body fluids. We're talking about blood, sweat, vomit, or saliva. So, unless those infectious fluids enter your body through broken skin, or your eyes, nose, or mouth, the virus has absolutely no way to infect you. Another major point of panic is the incubation period, which is the time between getting exposed and actually showing symptoms. For BDPV, this ranges from 2 to 21 days. Now, some people online have been saying, oh my gosh, this means that people could be walking around spreading it silently for 3 weeks. But the actual facts are that a person infected with Ebola is completely non contagious up until they start showing physical symptoms. The virus has to replicate inside the body and build up a massive viral load before it can be shed in bodily fluids. When the symptoms begin, they start with dry signs fever, fatigue, and muscle aches. The wet symptoms like vomiting, diarrhea, and actual bleeding only occur as the patient gets significantly sicker. The biological progression means that tracking exposures is highly manageable. If an exposed person doesn't have a fever, they cannot pass the virus to anyone else. Let's now talk about the math. In late May of 2026, the media reported nearly 1,000 suspected Ebola cases. Then, on June 2nd, the WHO and the CDC suddenly downsized that official count to just 321 confirmed cases in the DRC and 11 in Uganda. Some people on the internet found this weird and sketchy, but actually, this downsizing is how science is supposed to work in the field. In regions where malaria, typhoid fever, and seasonal flus are common, the early dry symptoms of Ebola look exactly like everything else. So, under emergency protocols, clinics logged every single person with a high fever as a suspected case to be extra safe. Once laboratory PCR tests were distributed to these remote areas, scientists were able to rule out the false alarms. So, the vast majority of those 1,000 people actually had malaria or a common viral infection, not Ebola. It wasn't a cover up, it was just an improvement in our diagnostic accuracy. While the risk to those of us sitting in Northern America and Europe is extremely low, we have to acknowledge that this is a devastating humanitarian crisis for all the communities in Eastern DRC. If the virus is less lethal and not airborne, why and how is it still spreading? The answer isn't biological, it's geopolitical and cultural. The epicenter of this outbreak is in the Ituri province, an area that has faced decades of armed conflict and mass civilian displacement. It's incredibly difficult for healthcare workers to track cases when rebel groups are actively fighting in the region. Additionally, local communities harbor a deep, understandable mistrust of outside authorities. When an emergency medical team shows up in full personal protective gear, it looks terrifying. Some traditional burial customs involve washing and touching the bodies of deceased loved ones, which can spread the virus. But when doctors try to stop these practices, it sometimes leads to community anger and even attacks on local clinics. To stop this outbreak, we don't just need medicine, we need empathy and cultural respect. But Here's the good news to end on. Science is moving faster than ever before. Even though we don't have an approved vaccine yet, we aren't starting from scratch. CEPI recently committed up to $50 million to fast track the modern mRNA 1215 vaccine candidate, which is designed specifically to target this strain. Using the same mRNA technology that helped us fight COVID 19, researchers can develop and test this vaccine in record time. At the same time, the WHO is running clinical trials in field hospitals using adaptive protocols to test existing antivirals. We're using all of the lessons that we used from previous epidemics to fight this outbreak. So, the overall takeaway here, don't let the clickbait headlines scare you into thinking you're defenseless. This outbreak is much easier to contain than something like COVID and holds a very low risk for anybody living in North America and Europe.